All right. Hey, everyone. I think we're going to try to start this thing, which only really works if all of you wind up your conversation about the Kraken. The game hasn't started yet. We'll talk about updates in a second about whether we're going to have them or not. There might be some voting involved, so I definitely will need your attention. The people in the bar line, that is impressive. Wow. Okay, we're still 8 or 9 deep. I don't know how to take that. But honestly, economics, like everything, insightful stuff, goes way better with a cocktail. So feel free to finish up in the line. Anyhow, my name is Dennis Karlinsky. I am a very proud class of 2001 Foster grad. When we get to the students on the way here, I was driving with my wife and realizing there's some students here that are probably class of 25. Is that right? And I was doing the math of how old you all were when we were graduating in our class. That was some bad math, I will tell you. But it is awesome to have all of you join us. I want to first of all say thank you for making the choice to be here versus at the Kraken game, especially to the guy with the jersey. Where's the guy? No, there's a guy. Oh, come on. Oh, he's back there. Okay, good. I'm like, please tell me he didn't leave. That would be awkward. So we have one guy with the Kraken jersey online for... Way to go, Dennis. Oh, wait. Coming back. Testing. Is this working? Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay. So back to the Kraken guy. I covered that. That's perfect. I don't think there's another mic. I don't know. Thank God we have this on video. This is great. This is always a good way to start this. It reminds me of being at work. All the demos work until it's time to go on stage, and then the demo never works, ever. So we'll try again. Welcome to the State of the Economy Forum. I and all the panelists and all the folks involved in putting this together really do appreciate you coming out and spending time with us here. Whether you're in Seattle, you could have gone to the Kraken, arguably the nicest day outside in like 6 months. If you're online, we've got people all around the world. I know we have our friend Shuhei in Japan, our friend Michelle in Maryland, and all around the world. I think we got like 1,000 people online at some point. So thank you for taking the time out from your day, especially halfway around the world. And what we usually try to do here is we have a little game that we call We Know Who the Last Person Is, and you'll see where I'm going with this. How many of you, this is the first time that you've come to one of these forums? Please raise your hand. Oh, that is awesome. Okay, a good amount of newbies. That's great. How many of you have been to 5 of these? Wow, okay, that's also a good amount of people. 10? Okay, I'm impressed. Well done. John's not sure, but I think we'll give you 10. 15? Still hands going up, Laura, okay. And all 21 of them. Yay, Mark, thank you. That is commitment. So one, well actually Ed, do you want to do your take on the Kraken game later? Okay, we'll wait till you're up here, okay. So we do have to take a vote. This is an important vote. Do we stay in a cone of silence on the Kraken game, which means that, oh, okay, wait, wow. Is this how voting works in some countries? I thought this was a democracy. What is happening here? Exactly, that's the problem. In fact, Andrew was killing me. He's like, if you want, I can stand to the side and go like this, and then you can let people know. All right, the only ask we have is this, just to make sure that our incredible professors and Chris can do a great job up here, try to keep it somewhat muted, especially if it's bad news. If it's bad news, nobody wants to know. If it's good news, go ahead and let us know. Is that fair? Okay, perfect. All right, so getting on with our list of things. For the first time in the 22 years of our event, we actually have a presenting sponsor. So with that, I'm delighted that we have Whittier Trust as our presenting sponsor. As you can tell, I ran through this many, many times. I would like to welcome Nick Momeyer to the stage, and he is Whittier's Northwest Regional Manager and a fellow Foster MBA class of 06 to say a few words. Come on up, Nick.
Thanks, Dennis. Good evening. My name is Nick Momeyer. I'm a senior portfolio manager and also head up our local regional team here in Seattle for Whittier Trust Company. I'm proud to be standing here for two reasons. First, as a representative of Whittier Trust Company. So Whittier Trust is the oldest and largest multifamily office on the West Coast. And we're extremely thrilled to partner with the University of Washington to support this event. Second, I'm very proud of being an alumni of the University of Washington Foster School of Business, yes, MBA program. And I can tell you for a fact that we're in for an eventful and insightful hour or so, as Professor Rice and Professor Glassman and other colleagues are up on stage. So with that, on behalf of my colleagues at Whittier Trust, I just want to say welcome. And we hope you enjoy tonight's event. So with that, Dennis. Thank you.
All right, and it's actually not in our first of all, I do want to share this with all of you. This is what happens when you get older, is that the font that they give you, like you could literally, it makes it easier to read, but to read a whole sentence, you have to flip the page, which is part of why I'm missing this. But I do want to say one thing about Whittier Trust is there's some times where you get a sponsor that really wants to be hands-on on a lot of things, and they've been awesome. They just said, hey, take the questions, and we got a lot of questions, pick the ones you want to go with and roll with it. So really appreciate the support and the flexibility that they've given us as well. So with that, I did want to remind folks that the way that this, and by the way, for me, it's amazing. I've done a bunch of these, and to look out and see so many people and know we have so many people online is mind-blowing, because we were talking a little bit about how this started. And this started as what we'll call Breakfast with Karma. So for those folks that have been around the school long enough and were lucky enough to spend some time with Karma Hadjimalaikas, that's about the only time I can, thank you, I can't get it right again. One of the most just amazing human beings who happened to also be super smart, super kind, and available to us. And I still remember, and I say this every year, and it reminds everybody of, she was the queen of, if something happens, something goes up, and then that means something goes down, and then something else goes up, and somewhere in there were interest rates, fiscal policy, and you're learning this as you go, and at the end you're like, oh, I got this. And if somebody had said, I'm going to teach you, the impact of fiscal policy and loosening of supply side economics in an hour, you'd be like, never. And she had a way of being able to do that. So what started out as, I believe, Breakfast with Karma, and after 20 years, I learned the story this last time. How many people were here last year? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so you'll reminisce with me on this one. I was confused because Ed was at that one, and I was confused how it was just karma. And so we asked Ed last year, and I believe you missed the bus. Is that right? Yes. So on the way to what would have been Breakfast with Karma and Ed missed the bus. It ended up being known as Breakfast with Karma and Ed. And that's kind of how it evolved over the years. But it was literally, I think, like 20 people at the first one. We were sitting around. I know it was at the faculty club once. We had like 25, 30 people, et cetera. So to see it grow into this is truly both amazing experience, but also talks, I think, about the legacy of Karma and how much people really are interested in just insightful, interesting information delivered by insightful, interesting people. So high bar for our group. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. As a reminder, similar program to what we've done in years past. One of our distinguished alumni is gonna come up and set the table for us with really a presentation that covers business, finance, community, all sorts of areas of breadth and depth. After that, we will bring up our panelists. And I know he rolls with me every year on this, but I kid you not, Chris Mefford's, Chris is our 2002 Evening MBA. His intro is a full 2 pages. So bear with me as I do this, because it is impressive. Chris is the president and CEO of Community Attributes, a planning and economics consulting firm, which he founded in 2005 with offices in Seattle, Denver, and now Memphis. Chris and his team at Community Attributes are known for bringing data to life in engaging ways to understand business and social challenges. In addition to an MBA from Foster, Chris earned a BA in mathematics from the University of Northern Iowa, an MS in urban and planning in urban and regional planning from the University of Iowa. We're delighted to have him come back and share his wisdom with us. Chris, come on up.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. Appreciate the energy in the room. Hey, I'm totally cool with goal shouts coming out of the crowd all throughout my presentation. So if you're so moved, or hey, it's only year 2 for hockey fans. Not everybody here knows what I'm talking about even at this point, right? And some of us are still learning the difference between icing and offsides, and some of us really may never. But if you're into the game and you shout out that we have a goal, no hard feelings from me personally. I'm really glad to be here. As Dennis mentioned, we have an office in Memphis now, which is me and a couple others. I relocated to Memphis over the past couple of years. It's been a frayed, F-R-A-Y-E-D relocation, so it's hard to pinpoint that. I might be the only person you know actively studying both the Memphis and the Seattle economies at the same time, trying to find those connections. Although Rebecca, wherever you are, our chat earlier inspired me of some of the efforts in the University of Washington down in that part of the country. Don't get me started on all that, because that can be a whole evening's worth of conversation all into itself. I like to focus on Seattle, be present here. I own and run a company based in downtown Seattle. And I'm glad to maintain that practice and spend a lot of time here continuing to work on projects. So you all have hard copies, right? So this terrifies me, because you're going to be flipping ahead when the conversation lulls, as it always does on about bar chart 7 or 8 or so. I won't be offended if you do that. I know you've got that, but this is on these 2 monitors as well. Technical difficulties have led us to go analog with your hard copy version there. But we are super active around here, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm glad to spend a lot of time in Seattle and to continue our research as a company in studying the local economy and telling stories about the economy. This is, I think, the 7th consecutive year I've done this here with the Foster MBA Economic Forum. Super fun. They did a risky thing. They let me take over the alumni Instagram account yesterday. Let me see the 2 hands of the people that follow the Instagram account that are out there. Please, come on, don't be shy, both of you. It was fun. I mean, you got like 3 hours of my time each in the efforts to post those Instagram accounts. I do have a newfound appreciation for that effort. Emily in Paris makes it look really easy just to click those things out. But yeah, there's 12 of us that are fans of Emily in Paris too. It's tough, and I learned that yesterday and really enjoyed it. I am going to focus a little bit on what we're doing here. I got to tell a joke though. My dad, I think he's home watching online. He texted me this morning. I'm grateful for his interest in my career. He's in Southeast Iowa, which is where I grew up. And he texted me the comic strip Pearls Before Swine. Any of you still read comics at this point in time? Well, this morning's was, the character is it's a pig actually, but it's like a student, not conflating any of that. It's, the pig says, he's taking an economics 101 exam, and the question is, what's the significance of low interest rates? And his answer is, a low interest rate means people have very little interest in what someone is saying. For example, when you teach economics, there is a very low interest rate. Okay. You know, so I share the dig as I get ready to wade through all kinds of bar charts with you all. You know, that's what dads do. They send kids, humor to challenge them a little bit before they get on and take the stage. So I'm good at that. I pass that on to my kids. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about global economy, the national economy, and the local economy. My strengths are the regional economy stuff. I defer to the expertise of the faculty, and I'm grateful to be a part of this event every year with them for these things that they know more than I do about important things like interest rates and global trade and those things. But I'm going to set the stage a little bit and keep an eye on time for you as well. The big theme throughout my talk is how we are recalibrating as an economy, whether it's nationally or most definitely regionally, we are recalibrating. Globally, I don't know that I'd use that term, right? On a global scale, we're in uncharted territory. We go through that as a species every so many eras and phases, and we're in one now that we haven't ever seen before. We're still riding these economic shockwaves from COVID. The last thing I want to do is talk about COVID. I don't want to, for 3 years, all I did is showed a slide about our economic recovery from COVID. And I would like to move on from that as much as more than anyone else, as much as anyone would, but globally, we're still riding these shockwaves out, right? The supply chain issues around the world. Of course, the Russia invasion of Ukraine has its own issues going on and still challenging things with disrupting supply chains and energy prices all throughout Europe especially. It affects things important to us here for your own well-being in this region related to trade. And I preach this in almost all my talks. There's only two ways to grow a regional economy. One is through importing capital, and the other is through trade. And so when you disrupt those forces, it doesn't go well. It takes a long time to work themselves out. And on a global scale, we're still going through that. We are tenuously hanging on to avoiding a global recession is the consensus amongst the people that have a point of view on that. The IMF, OECD, the Economic Council, developing countries based in Paris, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, their most recent proclamations are that, yes, we will avoid a global recession. The media, the indicators, we'll all we'll procrastinate our own here a little later on this evening. The fear of sliding into a recession has been ever present for quite some time. But we seem to persevere and keep pushing through that. And right now, there's more folks saying we're going to avoid a global recession than there are saying that we will have that recession. The volume of trade is a big indicator for that. I'm on slide 7 for those of you in the back that don't want to try to squint along here. That horizontal bar going across this slide shows what the average is. So a lot of what we're talking about right now, recalibrating, is mean reversion, right? Getting back to recovering from these shocks. And for the next couple of years, we're going to be in that ballpark, back in the ballpark of what the average trade has been over some time, after some world historic changes of shutting things down, opening things back up, things breaking, supply chains falling apart. We're working our way through that. The financial markets, of course, right now are very uncertain as we work things through. Here closer to home, probably more uncertain than they should be, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. For Washington State, when we talk about exports, it's important to know what we're talking about. Some of this gets pretty esoteric, like are we really adding value or are we passing value through? So the folks that gather data do a pretty good job of trying to tell you which they're representing. So for example, if you're Boeing and you are importing into the state of Washington $200 million worth of parts per airplane, and you sell that airplane for $300 million, what do we get credit for? The $300 million or the $100 million of the value added? Those are sort of esoteric parts of how trade data are gathered and represented. The other challenge of trade data is that a whole lot of our trade is not stuff that they put in container ships or physical things that are flown around the world. It's exporting services. Every international student that's here in this room right now, you are importing education that the University of Washington is exporting, and that's a great service that counts as exports. When I pay tuition for my son at University of California, Berkeley, California is exporting that education to me, and now my life's kind of crazy. I don't know which state is buying that anymore, if it's Washington or Tennessee in that regard, but you get the idea. It doesn't have to be in a container ship or something physical to count as an export. Our physical exports, though, are important. When aerospace makes a big part of it, it's such a big price tag, and it's a super cornerstone of our economy, especially across lots of occupations in our labor force, and it's on its way back while other things have been able to grow per slide 8 there. But we need to separate these things out to understand them, because aerospace tends to eclipse by dollar volume non-aerospace exports. China, Canada, and Japan have been our big trading partners for quite some time. We aggregate these data across 3 or 4 years because things can oscillate on a year-by-year basis. To really understand on a global scale who our trading partners are, it's good to see it in a little broader time frame. China is super important, and all the changes happening in China and all those trade relationships with China still rank very, very high. There's been a lot of uncertainties there over the past few years, and things have changed and evolved there. But for Washington State, for everything but airplanes. They're the number 1 trading partner. And when you look at aerospace, China's a close number 2 to Japan for the past few years. These things can change an awful lot. Of course, the Boeing company defines our aerospace sector. There's a whole bunch of other great companies and a lot of thousands and thousands of jobs in the supply chain as well that are here either originally because of Boeing or now are in parallel to this aerospace cluster that we have. And a lot of good news coming out of Boeing right now. They are hiring rapidly right now. They will hire hundreds, if not thousands of employees in 2020, or they will net add that many jobs in 2023 alone. Big orders announced this morning with Orion Air, 150 some odd 737-10 MAX airplanes. These are super crazy expensive, right? I've gone to the Paris Air Show before with these folks and just kind of hobnobbed and watched this conversation going on when people are talking about $500 million price tags on giant airplanes, and it's like any of us going to the home show buying a package of kitchen knives, and they're trading giant airplanes like that. So it's cool industry to be a part of, and we're glad to see Boeing growing, adding more production here, moving their production facility or expanding their production facility into surplus space that had been there in Everett after losing the 787. So lots of dynamic things happening. When you hear Boeing people talk and you hear them taking flack about moving headquarters out of Seattle and that sort of thing, Washington's the number 1 employment base by far of any place in the world where Boeing is. So they're a Washington company regardless of where some of the administrative offices are, and they're a huge part of our economy, and we're glad to see them doing well. Nationwide, of course, inflation and interest rates and all those things are super important and top of mind with everybody. We've gone through, and we're still going through, a lot of pain with the banking system in this country. We can talk about that a little bit. National migration patterns have been disrupted quite a bit as a result of COVID, or accelerated because of COVID, I should say. And housing, right? Everywhere we go, where there are strong economies, there are housing cost challenges, so we can talk about that quite a bit as well. I was going to say something really profound, but it lost me. Okay, we want to nip in the bud some of the forecasts because it is an economic outlook conference, and what we do is we look at other sources that are doing these forecasts, and we kind of blend them together and look at them, and we try to put out their numbers that are referenceable and sourceable. And folks are looking at continued growth for gross domestic product of 2.8% on a global basis and 1.6% here in the US. It averages over the decades around 2%, and when GDP growth is greater than 2% in any given year, that's seen as a reasonably strong year. That's the benchmark over under. This is real GDP growth, right, adjusted for inflation, which is super important to keep an eye on. Again, these giant shocks that we just went through are still working themselves out, and it's really the next 2, 3, 4 years that we'll start to feel like the majority of the COVID-driven economic impacts are starting to be behind us, and we can start to understand how well the economy is performing on its own. Inflation has been coming down, right? I mean, who'd have thought a few years ago we'd say, all right, 5% inflation. We really got this thing going now. We're going in the right direction. But here we are. We're done having silly debates whether inflation is transitory or permanent or what it is. The Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates a lot. We're going to talk about that. All with this goal in mind, is to bring inflation down to their target rate in the 2% range. And it appears to be going in the right direction. And we're going to talk about all these things. The key components of inflation have changed over the past year or so as well. In 2021, while the world was reopening in really sporadic manner and really hard to predict where and how it was reopening, imports and exports were driving a lot of the inflation. That is no longer the case as those numbers have come back down into less surged volumes due to COVID reaction. Now you see things like gross private domestic investment that is at the top of the list of driving inflation, sort of a lagging indicator, if you will, or a lagging force with inflation. So all these things are the different components about things. The past few years, it's been anything that's required energy or people has gotten more and more expensive, which is about everything it takes to drive an economy. how the Fed has reacted to it, and again, this is not my depth area of expertise, but I do know that the Fed has acted like interest rates adjustment and monetary policy is the only lever they have to address inflation. And we know there's other things they could be doing, but it's such an emphasis on this, and this is what it looks like. I'm on slide 16. The federal funds rate is the rate that the federal government charges to banks to loan money to them, and it plays out for all the different lending rates that we all do for businesses and consumer purposes. The purple line on this chart is the inflation indicator from the gross domestic product implicit price deflator, which means it's a good number because they can go back and look at new data and revise that, so it's more accurate than the CPI. And you can see what happens here. When inflation spikes, the Fed gets together and says, okay, we got to raise rate to make it harder for people to spend money and to drive this stuff up. Let's make it more costly to borrow money for this stuff so that we can reduce the fuel that's driving up inflation. So I wanted you to see those curves side by side so you can see that lag. It's about a year lag in the reaction time. Everyone likes to criticize the Fed, and that's just good entertainment for us to be able to do that. But what I'll give them credit for this time around is the advance notice of being able to tell people they're going to raise rates, right? Jerome Powell was saying 6 months before he did it, we're going to raise rates. It's going to be painful. It's going to happen. So for anyone to say that they were surprised by this or caught off guard or in a reaction mode of that, there's no leg to stand on for that case. They were really good at being out there well in advance of making those changes. And so here we are. The current Fed funds effective rate is a little over 5% as of a couple of days before, but we've been here before, right? We were there in 2007, and we've been up and down like that. Could be worse. It was 10% in 1989, right? So it was a whole lot worse back then. We've been used to zero for so long, 2009 through 2016. That it's these changes, it's the transition from going from one rate to the next that's tough. It makes everybody freeze. Like my math to buy my house related to my mortgage is now all off. I was willing to pay $500,000 for this house, and I had my budget planned around one number. Then all of a sudden, rates jumped 1% before I could do this, and I can no longer spend $500,000 on that house because my monthly budget is affected. I can now only spend $400,000 for that house. So those things matter in terms of, it could be even worse because it was 19% in 1981. So my point is interest rates really are not high from a historic perspective. They are higher than they've been the past several years, and moving from one rate to another includes painful transition costs, and that's what we're going through. If there's one thing businesses like, it's the stability and the predictability of the economic environment in which they're making decisions. And we're not in that mode right now. We're still working through an understanding of what is the cost of capital, and it's tied to a lot of these things like tech layoffs that we're going to talk about a little bit as well. But inflation's high, so we need to adjust for inflation with these things too. This slide simply shows what interest rates have looked like if you adjust them for inflation. And they're still high. Even with high inflation, our current interest rates are higher than it's been, but it is useful to factor that in. And finally, with my mortgage rate anecdote, I wanted to see how those play off of each other. Most of us are more in touch with what a mortgage rate is than what the Fed funds rate means. And you can see that delta a little bit when banks are lending money against what their cost of capital is. Of course, they've got to make money off those transactions too. So this gives you an indication of how these things track over time. 6.3% is the current U.S. average for a 30-year mortgage at present compared to 5.1% for the Fed funds rate. Okay, the last part of my presentation is focused here regionally. Like I said, I live in Memphis now. I spend a lot of time in Seattle still. I spend about a week a month or more or less, and my team is based here. We have an office in Denver as well. That has given me a whole new perspective on this region, as you might expect. Hey, we got pretty good problems in Seattle, all right? We got problems. We talk about those problems and we point fingers at those problems, but on a national scale compared to what other cities are going through, they'd love to have Seattle's problems, all right? And we can have that conversation, absolutely. But regional employment's strong. Some industries haven't fully recovered. We're going to shine a light on that in a second. Tech layoffs are big and they hang big. They're more global than they are local, but that's still playing itself out too. A lot of that is in response to these increased cost of capital, increased cost in general the past few years. So a lot of that is in reaction to big growth with COVID. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Seattle residents go back to office has big impacts, and housing is a big deal. Unemployment is 3.2% in the Seattle metro area right now compared to 3.4% in the US. This is pretty common for us to track, just a little bit lower unemployment rate. Labor force participation rate is a huge part to hold up next to that, to understand how people are engaged and whether they're able to even be in the labor force. Our labor force in Washington State tracks a little bit higher than the nation as a whole. The labor force was hit hard early in the pandemic. Different parts of the labor force hit harder than others. Women of color in particular, were forced to drop out of the labor force. And that has accelerated a lot of important conversations about wellness in the workplace and child care and helping people be gainfully employed in the labor force. Equity is a great topic that this region has been leading on in a good way. It is fascinating to hear the different way equity is discussed in Memphis, Tennessee compared to Seattle, Washington, like in other places as well. I'm doing work in Mountain View, California. We've been leading their economic development plan for quite a while. And different ways different people talk about different topics is very fascinating. In this region, black people tend to trend at a higher unemployment rate. They suffer the greatest of the inequities in this region. Wages are lower than other races. And in my observation and the stuff I've been a part of here regionally, the region's done a very good job of rallying around regional leadership issues to make sure actions are taken to address those inequities. And that's not going to happen over a 2 or 3 year period. That has to be vigilant and held high for a good long time in order for folks to feel good about the authenticity of those actions as they move forward. And this region's doing a great job. I think this regional economy is recalibrating. I'm showing you two charts on slide 25, the jobs that have grown over a 3 year period compared to the jobs that have grown most recently. A lot of economic development folks try to choose target industries, choose winners and losers, who they think their strengths are. Some folks that I really like working with are regions that say, hey, let's look who's growing, and whoever's growing, whether it's a new industry, an old industry, let's help them grow faster because they've got some momentum we can do more with. And that's what this slide's all about. But you can see the disparities in how things are changing. Right? You know, what's happened in a great way in the past year that I've put in bold there, food services and drinking places are growing again for the first time in a long time. Arts and entertainment is the first time. Those places were hit the hardest in 2020 with COVID. So we're glad to see some return to normality with those industries. Aerospace is growing rapidly right now as well, adding jobs. What you don't see on the right are the IT and the tech and the software companies that grew rapidly in the beginning of COVID from 2020 to 2022. So there's a lot of growth spurt that they had there, and any fall off of hiring right now is in reaction to that as well. They're still ahead, a still growing industry. This tech industry is world class in this region, and long-term growth of these industries, of course, is a defining part of our economy. It's possible mathematically to see some of these same industries on both slides, right? Over a 3 year period, aerospace is still down. They've been adding jobs for the first time heavily the past 18 months or so. Interestingly, on the right of slide 26, are the financial activities and retail trade that are down. And retail is a place with lots of turmoil and changes happening right now. It's very difficult to track job growth in the retail sector right now due to all the changes happening through online purchases and other experiences with that. 27 has our latest litany of layoffs that have been announced that we've picked up in the media. Actually, a company called Crunchbase tracks this. You can go to Crunchbase and see their watchdogs for tech layoffs. Far more jobs are announced worldwide with these layoffs for the companies than are happening locally. And I don't claim with any confidence it's going to stay that way. I'm just reading the news media and talking to the folks that know the companies as well. So it's less of a concern locally. Our economy here is big and strong and broad. There are plenty of tech companies that are happy to snatch up tech leadership, that anyone that's leaving any of our bigger tech companies. So it's going through a little bit of a bump, I would say, but it's nothing that is changing the economy in a grand way. I'll tell you what is changing, though, and not in a good way, is office workers that pretty much abandoned downtown Seattle. And those are pretty strong words that I'm intentionally using, of course. And the reason I'm saying that is, so this is a chart, this is all on the Downtown Seattle Associates website. They work with a vendor called Placer.ai, and they track things like cell phone data to see who's tracking where. Foot traffic is down less than half than it was pre-pandemic. This is a very Seattle story, okay? This is not a nationwide story. This is a very Seattle story. It's not only Seattle. San Francisco is as challenged as Seattle is to get folks to come back into the office. But when I say office workers have abandoned downtown Seattle, if you look at the numbers on the right, everything else is strong. Visitors and tourism is high. We have more people living downtown than ever before. Hotel demand is high. The only thing missing is the daytime office workers have left downtown. They're no longer acting like vested stakeholders in downtown Seattle. All right? And that's choices folks can make, but they need to hear it that way. I'm all for the distributed jobs hubs in different places around the region. That's a good thing. Other places in the region need to grow, but we need to understand the disinvestment happening in downtown Seattle right now by office workers choosing not to go there. All right? And I say that objectively. I don't mean that to be a values judgment on that choice, but objectively, that's what the data are showing. And I've had a hard time with this over the years, of course, as an employer myself. What I have observed in my own travels, though, is there's a tech savviness in this region that is a part of that. And we flog ourselves a lot for this thing that I'm speaking to here. But the reality is, other cultures in this country don't have a culture that can quickly adapt to Zoom calls, to working on teams, and to keep that productivity up in a distributed workforce. They don't get it, right? And we have such a tech-savvy workforce of smart, talented people moving here from all over the country that this region's able to do that better than other places, and that plays into that. So it's a yin and a yang kind of a thing, but it's a real thing, and I think it needs to be understood as such, because if downtown Seattle doesn't thrive, this region really doesn't thrive, and we need downtown Seattle to thrive. All right, finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about housing, and then I'll get out of the way. Housing is a big challenge here. It's a challenge anywhere in the country where job growth is high. 20 cities, 20 regions, whatever the actual number is around this country, are having the same conversation. Other places are not, right? But the places with strong growing economies and that have been growing for a long time, they are having this conversation about housing. What it means in this region, how it really shows out, this is work we're doing for Washington Roundtable, which is a statewide consortium of the leading employers in the state. They've asked us to help them get a handle on what housing costs, what the crisis means. What has happened in the past 7 years alone is it's only the higher incomes households that are buying houses, right? Higher income households are a greater share of the purchasing transaction than it's ever been. Just in 7 years, this shift. So on this slide, it's the blue bars that are the upper income households and the orange bars that are the lower income households. 2022 on the upper are the two pairs. And what this is showing on a region by region across the entire state of Washington is the shift. The percentage of homes sold to higher income households is much greater in 2022 than it was in 2015. And this shows you quantitatively more about the number of households. We are growing households at high incomes at a much faster rate than we are growing households at lower incomes. We did sort of a hack job on this to try to account for inflation from 2010 to 2022, and meaning we just changed the bin ranges to live up to $2021. But you add it all up, there's about 300,000 more households in upper income ranges in 2021 than there was in 2010. That's a profound change in just recent time. If you lived in this region for 25 to 30 years, you might feel like this has just been a gradual thing. It's actually been more accelerated in the past few years. Finally, like I said, sort of a mean reversion, getting back to just 2 slides on growth here. As we process other folks' forecasts for this, we see about 2% growth for jobs in 2023. We're reverting down to 1.3% the next couple of years. This region has always outperformed growth forecasts on jobs. So it wouldn't surprise me a bit if we grow more rapidly than that. It's a desirable place to be. People all over the country are moving here still. You'll have climate change refugees. We haven't talked enough about climate and what that means to the economy, but I believe these are pretty conservative job forecasts. Population trails jobs, job leads a little bit, and the population follows, but we can expect to have continued growth in this region. So we're working our way out of COVID. It's behind us for the most part. We're recalibrating, but growth for this region continues to be strong. Different parts of the economy participating in different ways. That's it. Thank you for your time and attention. Look forward to participating in the conversation.
All right, thank you, Chris. I'm trying to figure out how to state, that might have been the first time a comic off of a phone that was not being shown on a screen effectively landed a really good joke. Like, that was...
You can thank my dad for that. Right?
There you go. He was on, right?
He was online listening. He was online.
I love that. Well, for those that have been here before, I know there's a lot of slides, and I work at Microsoft. We love us some slides, trust me. But I'm going to try to condense. I had 3 takeaways from Chris, from the many slides. One is inflation is headed to 0 for sure. I got that. Okay, good. I nailed that one. Buying a house in 1981 was not awesome. Was that also close? Was that like 19%?
I mean, the cost of borrowing was not awesome, but if you still own that house in 1981, you're doing pretty well.
That's a good point, as long as you paid off the 19%. I like that. And then Chris is exporting a lot of out-of-state dollars to UC Berkeley. Is that?
That is true.
There you go. My family's still there. They thank you for your contributions. With that, as we have in previous years, we've collected a lot of questions that you send in advance. Actually, almost 100 questions. Some were really good, and for those, we thank you. Others, honestly, I mean, we have like a list. There were some questions that we thought maybe people answered the wrong thing, but those did not make it in. Just want to be clear. But for the others, we thank you so much. We whittled this down to 8 questions. As in years past, we're going to attempt to answer all 8 in a pseudo-time manner, which never works if you've been here before. And we cover many of these topics. That's beautiful. I have a note. If you've been here before, it never goes as planned. There we go. So with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce the panelists, though I think they're supposed to be up here by now. Oh, panelists, can you please come on up? And then I'll introduce them. I got the style. You know, I don't have a lot of responsibilities, and I'm crushing it. I can tell already. Really doing a great job. So now that we have the panelists up here, I'm going to introduce them. Now that they're up here. So, and I have to say, this first panelist has not only is she amazing, but she caught multiple mistakes that we made heading into this at about 20 minutes before we started. So I owe her for that as well. Debra Glassman. Debra is a teacher. Oh, hold on. Wait. Fine, go. That's awesome. Now okay, she's going to get 2 applauses. This is amazing. Debra is a teaching professor in business economics, as well as a faculty director of the Foster Global Business Center. She specializes in international finance, global macroeconomics, international trade policy, and European business, and she has been at UW for just 32 years. Welcome, Debra. Yay. I guess you get 2 each, I guess. Next, Thomas Gilbert. Thomas is an associate professor of finance and business economics at the Foster School. His research focuses on portfolio management for university endowments and public pension plans, as well as the impact of macroeconomic announcements on financial markets. Thomas is a 2-time winner of the Packard Award for Teaching Excellence, which is the school's highest teaching honor. Welcome again, Thomas. Oh, wait, we have one more, okay. Of course, are you guys kidding? Last, but certainly not least, Ed Rice. Ed had me trim down this a little bit because it was 2 pages before. Ed is an associate professor emeritus of finance and business economics at the Foster School. He used to, you did write this, didn't you? He used to specialize in corporate control, general corporate finance, and applied microeconomics. Now he specializes in retirement perks. Ed, thank you for coming out of retirement to join us this evening. All right, so with that, oh wait, before I start, Ed, is this a good time? Do you mind sharing your take on the Kraken and DVR viewership?
Those of you who are watching the Kraken game live, like you're not here because you're watching the Kraken game live, nobody watches sports live anymore. You just want to see maybe the last period, unless you're a really true blue hockey fan, which very few Seattleites are. And so if you're watching, you either have a very low opportunity cost of time, or you really love beer commercials. So you should be here watching.
Well done. Hold on. Actually, with that, do we have a score check? Anyone? 0-0, thank you. It's weird, there's almost no one knew the score. Huh. 40 people out of 250, this is good. But wait, for those that are wondering, when Ed exchanged this with us, he also didn't you mention the nuclear war?
That's later.
It's late, okay, got it, that comes up later, perfect. All right, so with that, reminder, we're gonna have a question, some or all the panelists will answer. We have an estimated amount of time that they're gonna spend on it, which obviously never works, but we'll give it a shot. So with that, first question, building on the labor market realities that Chris teed up, let's go deeper into the causes and thoughts on the future state of labor. Thomas, Debra, then Ed.
All right, good evening. I first of all want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to take 20 minutes to talk about this, because I like to talk, as you all know. It really warms my heart to see everybody here, all these alums I have had or have not had, depending on whether you were in the evening program, okay, fine, or the daytime program, yes. Oh. Now let me talk about the labor market just a little bit. Chris did a great job of summarizing so the big numbers. Like the 3.4% unemployment rate that we're sitting at right now, I'd like to remind you that the last time this happened was in May 1969, which is way before my time. Oh. This is really a historic low. By September 2022, we had recovered all lost jobs from COVID. So all 21 million jobs had been recovered. This took 29 months to recover these jobs. If you compare this to 2001, the dot-com crash, that took 46 months to recover these jobs. And in 2008, the great financial crisis, it took 77 months to recover all these jobs. So the rebound has been really very impressive. But at the same time, as Chris mentioned, there's all these big layoffs that are making the headlines of all the Wall Street Journal and the likes, those Amazon and Disney and 3M and many other companies that lay off significant portions of their staff as a percentage or in absolute numbers. So you have these great national numbers and then seemingly some worrisome numbers by big companies. And I'd like to remind everybody that over 50% of workers work for small and medium-sized businesses. So the majority of the US workforce is in small and medium-sized businesses. So these big headline numbers by the Metas of the world are not that worrisome in some respect for the broader economy. And this is reflected, I have 5 pages of this, so you'll see me flip. Now, this is reflected a little bit in last month's non-farm payroll number of 253,000, which was a very strong number. Now, these numbers are declining, which some of this makes sense, and I like Chris used the word recalibration. There is a recalibration going on. We cannot observe 500,000 new non-farm payroll jobs every month in perpetuity. Like this just cannot happen. It has never happened before, and it will not happen going forward. So when we see these declining numbers in the 200,000 range, this is good. This is a return to normal. Now, why are there some layoffs? And I want to talk a little bit about this. Now, for those of you who took a finance class with me, you remember the perpetuity formula. Brandon? Brandon? Very good. Oh.
Wow.
Now, Brandon was my best student, and I was taking a low-risk bet here. But the present value, the price, is the expected cash flow divided by R minus G, R being the discount rate minus the growth rate. This, if you think about a perpetual growth formula, just to keep things simple. Now, the discount rate, as Chris mentioned, the cost of capital has gone up. The risk-free rate has gone up. If you think about the capital asset pricing model, the cost of capital has gone up a little bit. At the same time, G, the growth rate of these cash flows, is recalibrating. We have been used through COVID to just crazy numbers, whether that's in the housing sector or in the cloud sector. If you think about AWS or Azure, and you hear these numbers, 30% growth and 40% growth and 25% growth. And this was great, and we all enjoyed rising stock prices of our local companies. So many of you holding, I'm sure, lots of stock in them. It's awesome. But this cannot continue in perpetuity. We have to all wake up to the fact that G equal 25% is completely unreasonable on a long-term basis. And so movements, let's say in AWS growth to G equal 15%, 10%, it seems so small, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But if your business is growing at 10% a year, I think our friends in the front row say, this is pretty good. But now we're saying, well, it's less than 25. So it's a recalibration. And I think some of that, while painful, is necessary. And on the expected cash flow side, the numerator of that formula, well, there's several things going on, right? This is lowering a little bit. So if you think about the tech sector, a lot of the hiring that took place during the pandemic to sustain all this, the demand that was going on, were expensive hires. Like the Amazons of the world hired very expensive people who, by the way, right now are complaining about getting out of their pajamas to go to the office 3 days a week, for which I have no patience whatsoever. So these were expensive hires, and this eats into your profits. And at the same time, from a revenue point, this is on the cost side if you want, and on the revenue side, a lot of clients, again, if you think about cloud clients, which is, again, a big part of our local ecosystem, are in a phase of they're seeing also a recalibration on their side. So they want to control costs. So they look at their cloud provider and say, optimize my costs. I want to stay a client. I need you. I need all these services on the cloud, but we need to calm down. And so these expected cash flows are just going back to some softer levels of growth, but some of these are just completely normal. So there's these great national numbers, some worrisome sort of big firm numbers, and I try to do through a beautiful formula from Finance 101 to remind you that some of these adjustments are perfectly normal, and while painful, it's some recalibration to some level of normality that I think is good. We're over time.
We are. Debra.
Okay, that's in case you haven't noticed yet, the view from up here is that you are a captive audience for a review of economics and finance concepts. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about multiplier effects, and in particular, how long it will take to reduce inflation, and with the side effect that probably will get some increase in unemployment as part of that process. Generally, we think that the multiplier takes at least 1.5 years, maybe 2 years to work through the whole economy, which means that the first interest rate increase, which was March 2022, will not have its full effect seen before September of this year. And the most recent interest rate increase, last week, We probably will not see the full effect until November of 2024. So if we predict that unemployment is going to go up as inflation goes down, and actually unemployment is a lagging indicator, it takes a bit longer to see the unemployment effects, then we may well be seeing the increase in unemployment from this 3.4%, which is historically very, very low, play out over months and actually a year or two from now, all the way through 2024. And since November 2024 is a rather interesting month from a political perspective, we might think about what the implications of that could be.
Okay, I would also like to start by thanking you all for coming. It's really fun to have people, now that I'm not a professor anymore, I'm kind of a makeshift professor, it's really fun to have people want to listen to you. So thank you for coming. And also, I want to thank Nick for sponsoring this program, which we never had before, and I think my retirement is correlated with this in some way. Now, I really have nothing to say about this question, but I figured it's the first question, I ought to answer it in some way. So,
That's good.
what I think about the labor market here is that there was a big shock because of COVID. I don't know anybody who doesn't think this is a big shock. This was a big shock. And when we have a big shock like that, lots of things change a lot. The whole organization of business, because of the supply chain, because of money that was given away for free, because of all kinds of things, there's going to be a big shock. And when there's going to be changes. And these changes are going to be big. And what we are seeing now is a shakeout of these changes. Now, how are these things going to shake out? What are downtowns going to look like? Which industries are going to win? There are going to be big winners in some industries. There are going to be big losers. And there's a lot of disagreement about who's going to win and lose. I'm not sure how that's going to shake out eventually, but that's where we are now. We're shaking out. And we will see how it turns out. But I don't really have probably as good a feel for that as you do, because I'm not a professor anymore and I can't tell.
That was it? Okay, that was it. You know, this isn't bad compared to last year. I mean, last year I think we were 5 minutes behind after the first question. We're only about 3 minutes behind, so we're really making incremental progress. Couple of things. So I do want to point out, as Debra mentioned about captive audience, we are running way behind. So just think about sticking around for a little bit extra at the time. Video folks, we might run over, just heads up. 3 things I took away from this, I'm sure others did as well. Thomas makes you remember important stuff that he will test you on in front of 1,000 people while smiling. That was the best part. He's also somehow aware that I go to work 3 days a week in my pajamas. That was really weird, but really spot on. And for those that are already texting, makeshift professor is not a thing. So we don't offer that class at UW. There is no path to that, at least as far as I know. Question 2, inflation. It's a thing. What are some of your thoughts on why inflation is where it is today and where it may be going directionally? Deb, Ed, Thomas.
So Chris mentioned something earlier, brought a word back from a couple years ago, transitory. You might remember that fairly early on, as inflation was rising, a lot of policymakers, led by the Federal Reserve, were saying, we're not worried about inflation because it's due to transitory factors, suggesting it will fix itself. There's nothing we need to do. And at some point in the fall or winter of 2021, policymakers, the Federal Reserve in particular, gave up on the idea that inflation was transitory and started talking about it being persistent and requiring action. And then in March of 2022, the Fed started to act and had the first of what turned out to be 10 consecutive interest rate increases. The Fed got a lot of flack for having talked for so long about inflation being transitory. But I'm starting to think that maybe some of it was transitory after all, and that that's one of the reasons why we're seeing at present unemployment being so low at a time when inflation is still high and is being fought with contractionary monetary policy, with interest rate increases. So if you think about this in aggregate supply, aggregate demand terms, that's the Fed is shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left, contractionary monetary policy, but at the same time, the unwinding of a lot of the supply chain disruptions that we saw is shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right. The result being that inflation is coming down, but unemployment is kind of staying where it has been. And if you're interested in the reduction of supply chain pressures, I recommend the New York Federal Reserve Bank's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, which really tells the story. That doesn't necessarily give us a prediction about what will happen next in the supply chain, and if you ordered that exercycle 2 years ago and you're still waiting, won't tell you when it's going to arrive. However, it is suggesting that on the supply side that we have some factors operating in opposition to the contractionary monetary policy.
Okay. So I'm going to take an entirely different tack about this. And I want you to think back, those of you who had my microeconomics class, think back to the first couple of weeks. We did supply and demand. And one of the things that happened is we talked about how simple supply and demand was. We shifted some curves. It was really easy. And then I said, but people make mistakes with this, and you're not going to do that. And then at the end of the discussion, I said, if you do make mistakes with supply and demand, and you don't understand whether this is a shift in quantities or a shift in the curve, I will find you wherever you are and rip your lungs out. That is what I said, okay? Now, we got some questions about inflation that suggest, so this is kind of macroeconomics, but it's still aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We got some questions about inflation that I am glad I don't know who wrote these questions because I would rip their lungs out. And a big part of this confusion about supply and demand is whether things are a consequence or whether things are a cause of prices and quantities. And what you have to understand is prices and quantities are a consequence, not a cause of things. There are fundamental factors that cause things, that shift supply and demand curves, but ultimately prices and quantities are what the model predicts. So one question, you know who you are if you're out there, one question said, are the increases in margins, are they the cause of inflation? Margins are a consequence of shifts. They are not a cause of shifts. The idea that firms, suddenly got greedy and increased their margins, firms are always greedy, all the time, every day, just like you are. You don't go into a store and you say, gee, here's a little horse figurine. It says $10, but I think that's too low. I'm going to give him 15. Nobody does that, okay? So you've got to understand that these shifts are because of fundamental forces like, you can't get things loaded at the docks, or you can't get things off the docks, or there's a war going on and they're not letting boats come out of the harbors, and these are things that cause shifts. Margins are an outcome. And there were other questions like that that I can't remember anymore because I'm too old. But in any case, keep your lungs and start thinking about whether there are fundamental shifts that are moving things or whether they are causes.
It's very scary to follow this.
Yeah, just
No, you should have seen Ed in our prep meeting. This is a calmed down version of our preparatory meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago. He said 2 weeks to process this.
This is the edited version.
This is the edited version. Yes. All right. Beep. All right. Is what happened. On inflation, I want to remind you, I like to look at the financial markets. I'm fundamentally a finance professor, and I think it gives us lots of indications through the wisdom of crowds and efficient markets. 5-year break-even inflation, which is the difference between yields of treasury, inflation-adjusted treasuries and nominal treasuries, is at 2.22%. Compared to last year when we last spoke, it's down 0.8%. 10-year break-even inflation is sitting at 2.23% today, and that's down about 0.5% from last year. So these numbers are trending in the right direction. They were not, what I said last year, if I recollect, was that inflation expectations are not that high over the long run. So financial markets are expecting things to be normal at a 5-year horizon. And these numbers are even trending down, which is consistent with some of the data that Chris showed earlier. But yes, there are, if you look at some core numbers, core CPI or core price consumer index and so on, that exclude volatile categories, it's still high. And I think at the Federal Reserve in that room there, they're still worrying that there are some trends there. While they're moving in the right direction, they're not moving as fast as they would like. And I think this is why they are continuing to raise rates more slowly right now, because we are seeing some of these effects. Now, a manifestation of all of this, you see, I'm trying to make sure I don't say anything stupid, so it doesn't slap me. A manifestation of these forces, a way we can look at it, is this wage price spiral that you may have heard about, which is the idea, right, that as higher wages for whatever reason will eat into profits of the firm, and then the firm will raise prices to pass it on to consumers. Pass this on, this will lead to higher wages, and then this loop, higher wages will lead to higher demand leads to higher prices, and you can tell this sort of circular story there that can be self-reinforcing. And I think that, again, in that brown room in Washington, D.C., they are worried about some all the forces, fundamental forces that Ed mentioned, that are sort of driving these effects. And if they can't get this under control, as Jay Powell often says, like if we can't get prices under control, it makes the economy just very hard to steer going forward. So the Fed, I think, worries about this a lot, and I think is taking good actions to control things without trying to sink the ship. But it's not easy.
Well, I have to say, you get kudos for transitioning and segueing from Ed's comments, so that's right off the bat. For those that had the second question is when we would have to do our first public service announcement on your bingo card, you win. The UW does not condone the use of physical force in response to any wrong answers in econ class or any other class. Got to get that on video, Ed. Number 3. Staying in the ballpark of inflation, how do you evaluate the role of the Fed in using interest rate adjustments as a tools to managing inflation and balancing the risk of recession versus worrying about an overheated economy? Glad you guys have that in writing. Ed, then Deb.
Okay, first of all, the UW cannot do anything to me. You're still at risk. Okay. So I'm going to tell a story of my finance class, those of you who had my finance core class back in the day. When I started teaching finance, it was a period of high inflation, and you try to get across fundamental concepts, and students would say, but what about inflation? This won't work with inflation. Inflation, inflation, inflation. You couldn't get through anything without appealing to inflation. And then as my life continued and the economy continued, all of a sudden you'd start teaching about inflation, and the students would be looking out the window and saying, why are you talking about this inflation? There is no inflation. Inflation doesn't matter. Come on, let's move on to real finance. Don't you know what's going on in the world? Well, inflation matters, and it's all over the world, and you got to understand, if you're going to get a degree, you have to understand the difference between real things and nominal things, and not just, today, like in a deep way all the time. I was told by my colleagues, I said, so I'm going to talk about the real rate of interest, and they said, well, you're going to have to explain it to the people in the crowd. I said, they've taken their MBAs. They got to know the difference between real things and nominal things. They said, no, I think you should give an example of, okay, so I'm giving an example. So when I taught finance, I used to talk about the real rate of interest. So think about what the nominal rate of interest is. The rate that you see in all the graphs that Chris, well, not all the graphs, but most of the graphs Chris presented. When the Fed says it's raising rates, it's a nominal rate. A nominal rate of interest says, the one-year rate says, if I forego spending $1 today, I'll have $1 plus interest tomorrow. So I'll have more tomorrow because I'm foregoing one today. I'll have 1.1, let's say, 10% more dollars. Okay, now let's think about the real interest rate. The real interest rate is if I forego eating an apple today, how many apples I'll be able to eat in a year. So if I invest my money, let's say an apple is $1, makes the math easier. They told me there should be no math. So if I invest $1 today, I forego eating an apple today. And I forego eating an apple today, I get $1.10 tomorrow. But if the rate of inflation is 5%, I got to pay $1.05 for that apple. So approximately, I am only eating 1.05 apples if I forego an apple today. This means the real rate of interest, what I'm really earning on my money, is not 10%, it's really 5%. And one of the differences between the way I think about the world and the way I think most economists think about the world is we think in real terms. Everything that matters is in real terms. This nominal stuff is just annoying, but really, real terms is what matters. If GDP is going up in nominal terms but not in real terms, who cares about the nominal terms? It's what's happening in real terms that really matters. Now, what you have to understand, and what Chris showed, is that the interest, actually, Chris, I want to take a little departure from what Chris said, or push back on what Chris said. The real rate of interest through most of this period of rising rates has been severely negative. The real rate is expected, is the rate you're going to get on things like treasuries minus the expected rate of inflation. And what Chris shows is the actual rate of inflation, but the expected rate of inflation has been up around 7-8% for a while here. And the real rate is just moving forward to 5% now. And that suggests so all these people who are talking about how high interest rates are not high. Interest rates are low. And right now, Thomas probably checked in the markets, but I'm guessing about 1%. Actually, I think Chris had a slide on that. About 1% is the difference. And these, so interest rates are low. The Fed is not, exploding interest rates. The Fed is getting the real rate close to a sensible real rate instead of a comically low real rate. So, you know, one of the things, so interpreting the world this way, one of the things you have to think about is what has happened to wage rates. Everybody talks about how wonderful the labor market is. Thomas talked about how wonderful the labor market was. And there are lots of jobs, but when you look at wage rates, people say that the market's doing so well. Wages went up, you know, 4% last year. Yes, wages went up 4%, but inflation was more than 4%. Real wages declined. Real wages declined. It's not such a great time when real wages are declining. And right now, we're getting to a point where maybe real wage increases are about zero, maybe slightly positive. But for most of this period of COVID, real wages were declining, not increasing. And so I have no expertise in how the Fed should handle this, but I do have expertise in how to interpret what their results have been.
Debra?
So I want to talk a bit about how the Fed is handling the inflation problem. And I think it's important to put it in the context of the experience of the early 1980s. The last time, as you saw in Chris's graphs, the last time we had really high inflation and really, really high interest rates. That's when the central bankers running monetary policy all around the world were in their formative years. They learned the lessons of the early 1980s, and what they're doing today is entirely predictable given the lessons that they learned. When we had inflation in the early 1980s and Paul Volcker was running the Federal Reserve, he diagnosed the problem as a wage price spiral, as Thomas described it. Economists now call that an inflation expectations augmented Phillips curve. But the key element is that inflation expectations affect actual behavior, including wage negotiations and price setting. And what Volcker determined was that the only way to reduce inflation expectations was to crank up interest rates high enough and keep them high enough to throw the economy into a recession. Now, Jerome Powell and his colleagues are approaching current inflation in the same way. And in fact, you can look at the speeches. They are deliberately using the same words that Paul Volcker used 40 plus years ago. Whether you agree with their approach or not, it's important to understand what they believe and why they're acting that way. They are following in Paul Volcker's footsteps. And they are therefore going to keep interest rates up until they see the inflation rate come back down to their target of just 2%. And we're not anywhere near that now. Now, unlike Thomas, I don't always trust the wisdom of the stock market. And I think the stock market is completely off base in the way it's reacting to inflation. It seems like every downward movement in inflation is seen as an indicator that the Fed will pause interest rate increases or, in fact, just do a U-turn and start cutting interest rates. And that completely ignores the fact that it's not what Paul Volcker would have done. It's not what Jerome Powell and his colleagues are planning to do. They're going to be keeping interest rates up until inflation gets back down. And any talk of a cut in interest rates being just around the corner is just wishful thinking.
Okay, let me just pause that timer. Only 11 minutes for our 7-minute question. We crushed that one. Deb, you're definitely sending the stock market a Christmas card. Is that what I just got out of that? Big fan. Okay, and then I wrote all this stuff down and just said, Ed said a lot of stuff about apples. Real apples, I think. I got lost somewhere in the apples, but it felt like you all got it. So I really, on the way out, if someone could explain that to me, that would be awesome. Number 4, banking crisis. And by the way, we wrote this, I think, a week and a half ago, so note the name that we used here. Banking crisis. Is it officially a thing? Are the events triggered by SVB a harbinger of what's to come for a broad swath of the banking industry. Chris, Deb, Thomas.
SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, that was the first of the regional banks to create all this attention, right? Which is just, it's terrible oversight, terrible management, terrible media coverage, right? Where it hits the road, in my judgment, is businesses that save with banks and borrow from banks, and consumers that save in banks and have the deposits in banks. It shouldn't be on us to evaluate a bank's balance sheet, right? And this is what Warren Buffett said. I was talking to Debra, you were actually in his presence just last week, right? And it shouldn't be on consumers to have to understand banks' balance sheet. That's what regulatory oversight is for, which has been lax, it's been rolled back, the oversight was bad. And per Ed's point, with everybody being greedy, someone's going to exploit that, and that's what happened. And then the media coverage made it sound like it was rather systemic, which I suppose it could be if people don't get their you-know-what together to provide oversights of banks. So it's not a nationwide banking problem unless there's bad behavior from the top down, which is what that was all about. That's my read on things.
I think that's you, Deb.
Okay. The recent turmoil in the banking industry makes us think a lot about what happened in 2008 and do a little compare and contrast. That would make an excellent exam question. But there are a couple things that have really struck me about the recent bank turmoil. First of all, that bank failures like SVB can be traced to government bonds, what we have always called the risk-free asset. And we say banks are allowed to do only really safe things like hold government bonds because they're risk-free, and yet now the headlines are telling us that it was really risky for these banks to be holding government bonds. It turns the whole argument on its head, and I had to change a whole lot of slides too because of that. It turns out that if interest rates are rising, and as Chris reminded us, no surprise that they're rising, that bonds that are not held to maturity are risky, and that banks around the country are holding a lot of assets on their balance sheet that are worth much less than what they had put on their books. So that's the first thing that's surprising and interesting. The second thing that's interesting and has turned 2008 on its head is that in 2008, the banks we really worried about were the big money center banks, the too big to fail banks. And we looked at the regional banks and said a lot of them are actually really safe and well run and are prudent and did not hold lots of securitized mortgages or mortgage-backed securities or create all sorts of exotic derivative strategies. Unlike 2008, the story about banks today is the story about regional banks looking very shaky and everyone wanting to think about whether they should take their money out of regional banks and put them in the big money center banks. So another story that's turned on its head. So here's what keeps me up at night. When you look at commercial real estate, so office buildings, malls, warehouses, et cetera, regional banks are the primary lenders to primary commercial real estate lenders. Something like 70% of all commercial mortgages are held by regional banks. And commercial real estate is facing some really big risks. You've got the whole carryover of work from home and fewer people in offices and companies not needing more office space, low occupancy rates that are continuing to fall. And here's another delay story. A lot of mortgage refinancing is coming up in the next year, in the next 5 years. So the regional banks, who like other banks are facing customers who have to deal with higher costs of refinancing, higher interest rates, also, like other banks, are not really feeling in a lending mood, and we're going to see this clash between the borrowers who would like to refinance and renegotiate and maybe stretch out their loans, and the banks who are not seeing commercial real estate as such a great investment on their balance sheets anymore. And the regional banks could be in real trouble. And that's something to watch for, not just right now in 2023, but over a few years into the future.
The comparison with 2008 is interesting and always reminds me of this book, This Time is Different, which the book really says this time is never different. It's always the same crisis, hence the title. And back in 2007, everybody believed house prices always go up and only ever go up. And then everybody woke up the next year, it's like, oh, house prices can go down. And I think we have evidence, there's testimony and emails of bankers inside big, smart, sophisticated banks that had models where, the growth rate of house prices, the negative number was not allowed and was not feasible in their model. And now I feel like we sat in some people sat in these regional banks and banks in general a year ago and said, well, interest rates are always low and they will always be low. And it's just like, why is anyone surprised by some of this? Is sort of, I find just amazing. So just to summarize a little bit what Debra said, right? Banks as assets and liabilities, and it holds government bonds on its asset side and has deposits as liabilities. And when deposits start moving for whatever reason, many different reasons, then they have to, fund these deposit outflows. And at some point, well, you have some cash, but at some point you have to sell these assets that you hold. And these regional banks were under a very special regulatory framework where they did not have to mark to market these long-term bonds. And so these bonds, because interest rates had gone up, had lost value. On the balance sheet, it looked like they're fine, but they had to sell these bonds for 50 cents relative to face value. And so this then led these banks to have to sell these assets at a loss, and then people lose confidence, and then more deposit flow out, and then they have to sell more, and that's a run. And the bank run is this fascinating, at some level, behavioral effect that was just amazing to watch. What I want to say here is I do believe that the regulators did the correct things in the sense that the banking sector is critical. It is an important pipeline for money to flow. And when we are worried about these banks failing, when there is a run on a bank, we want the regulators to step in, take the bank in receivership, and hopefully sell the assets to the highest bidder. And they've done this 3 times, and this was done very quickly. It's typically done over a weekend. You may want to think why this is typically done on a weekend. I'm sure all of you can figure this out. And these are good things. And I want to make it clear that these are not shareholder bailouts, and these are not bondholder bailouts of these banks. These shareholders will be wiped out or lose significantly, and the government did not bail out the owners of these banks. We can argue about insuring deposits. The FDIC insures deposits up to $250,000, and the Fed stepped in and said, we're going to insure all deposits of any size. And some people might say, well, is that right? Is that wrong? I don't know. I don't have a super strong opinion on this, but there's an element of we want to maintain confidence in these banks to keep the pipes moving. And it's also important to remember, however, that the Fed made it very clear when they insured large deposits that any losses that might incur, which are to us as taxpayers, because eventually we are paying for this, will be funded through the asset sale. So when the bank gets sold, they will use this asset sale to cover any losses to taxpayers. So in that sense, I hope that no one here was thinking this is a bailout of anybody, because I don't think this was. This was a good action by a regulator to maintain a banking system operational. But Debra's worries are very well funded, and they're keeping a tight look on this, and regulation will change for small and medium-sized banks because of this. That's a fact.
Okay. So we officially, for the first time in our history, run so far behind that Andrew had to come over and did you guys see how subtle that was? Gave me a little note that said, you're way behind.
Not
So-
you personally. Just,
Yes,
it's
yeah,
not-
that is actually, that's a good point. So panelists, pretend the audience isn't here. We're going to skip question 8, and we're going to take half the time on 5, 6, and 7, or 5 and 6 at least. Everybody got that? Okay, and we're back. That was our TV timeout that none of you saw. Number 5, the one that we're taking half our time on. Between Debra's concerns about commercial real estate and rising interest rates driving higher mortgage rates, what's the overall state of the housing market? Thomas, super quickly. Chris and Ed, very quickly.
Dude, I have super strong opinions about the housing market.
was a
Everybody
minute.
knows this.
You can do this.
I'm a firm believer in density, YIMBYism, and rezoning. But anyway, I will not talk about these things since I have no time. But what is interesting, right, is that there's areas of the country where house prices are still increasing, and there are areas like and California, the western states and so on, where house prices are decreasing significantly. 31% of urban areas have seen price decreases over the last year, and some of them very significant price decreases. Again, I'll repeat the same thing I said last year and the same thing I said, I don't know, apparently a long time ago, tonight, is that house prices growing at 20% a year, as many of you, I'm sure, experienced in the Seattle area in 20 or whatever, and you were like, yeah, I'm so much wealthier. This is, again, completely crazy, right? House prices do not grow at 20% on any sustainable basis. If you look at long-run numbers from the Case-Shiller Index or Bob Shiller in general, his website has great data on this, it's 3 to 5%. And again, so it's just recalibration of everything that needs to happen. And I think we'll continue to see this. I'm done.
I'll just add on that really quickly because Thomas and I agree on all these things. You're paying for land in this area. You're paying for access to high-paying jobs. Unless you don't have a high-paying job, then you cannot pay for that access to a high-paying job, right? And the density that Thomas referenced is a local policy that requires local leadership beyond which local voters will be supportive of. So I live in Memphis, Tennessee. The housing market's a little bit different. And you can experience that viscerally when you cut roots and move into another place like that, which is, it just makes it all bald. But that's what you're paying for is the land and not the house and the value creation of the density on that site. And here we pay for land preservation outside of the urban growth area. We pay for the NIMBYism that we indoctrinate into our communities of not allowing density near us, right? So we pay for a lot of externalities in that land that have nothing to do with the house that you occupy.
Okay,
How's your double lot?
my double lot is doing very well. I'm going to skip a really good story, but
I mean, Andrew can only get more
Thank you.
mad at us. I mean, you may as well tell the story.
so when you grade me a little higher. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about local housing and the local government and the city council and the state government. Unbelievable how the city government has evolved into a situation where they have committees that are trying to figure out how to suck money away from rich people. That is their goal. They're very clear about it. We want to figure out a way to suck it, and we're going to do anything we can to do it. And then the state helped them out with this capital gains tax. Now, I have to say, capital gains tax in general is an abomination. It shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist at the national level. It shouldn't exist at the local level. But with inflation, it's especially an abomination. And why is that? Suppose I buy something, buy a stock for 100, and then 10 years later I sell this stock for 200. The government says, oh, you got 100 capital gain, you got to pay taxes on the 100 capital gain. But what if the price level has gone up to 300? Well, I actually am selling this stock for 67 in real terms. I have lost money. I've lost 33% on this stock, but they're still taxing me in real terms. This is like those of you who had my finance class where I talked about big Ernies, like times $0, and little Timmies, like times $30. they're saying you made money because we gave you these little timmies. You didn't make money. In real terms, you lost, but they're going to make you pay taxes anyway. This is just a ridiculous way to tax, and it's because they think they can get the rich people they can suck something out of the rich people. And the problem is, if the rich people are your enemy, you're not going to have any rich people. They have alternatives, and they will not be here.
Okay, that was good. I'm trying to figure out whether I'm regretting having you tell that story or not, but I think it was great. Capital gains tax clearly loved here, especially the folks in the back. So we're going to move away from capital gains tax for a second. Let's zoom out a bit and cover globalization, especially from a U.S. and China point of view. And even though we're running a little bit late, you get bonus points if you cover Russia. Debra and then Ed.
The U.S.-China relationship is in a very different place than it has been in recent years, and is getting worse instead of getting better. Kind of surprised that a lot of the trade barriers from the Trump era policy are still in place. And in addition, the U.S. is pushing back very hard on China's efforts to develop technology leadership. Look at computer chips, for example. As China's been trying to move up the value chain, it's confronting the U.S. saying, we're going to make sure that you can't in areas like computer chips. Last fall, the U.S. decided we will not sell China anything that will support the production of the most advanced computer chips. And we've pressured our allies to do likewise. There are two possible results here. One is that China develops its own advanced chip-making capacity with its own technology. So we sort of decouple the whole technology in that industry. The other possibility is China says, well, if we cannot develop the advanced chips, we're going to go all in on the mature legacy chips, for which there's still a really big market. Automobiles, for example. And we could find ourselves very dependent on China for the legacy chips. And it will be our fault because we forced them into that part of the market. So lots more to come, and I'm sure next year we'll still be talking about it. And I will not claim any points for Russia.
So I want to say a couple of things about China's relationship and war in general. So most economic models, all the ones I taught you for sure, do not incorporate any benefit you get out of your trade counterpart being happy or sad. When you have a competition for global domination or whatever China and we are expecting to get out of our national status, then when we get happier, China is sadder. And when we get sadder, China is happier, and vice versa. And when that happens, things change a lot. And we're in a situation where when I get surplus, the Chinese don't want to have surplus, and that is going to reduce trade. I think already trade with China is questionable with all these tariffs that haven't gone away, it's my impression. Although Chris's data suggests that we're still trading a lot with China. But we are going to, I think in the long run, lose a lot of gains from trade because the world is dividing into these warring elements. You know, Clausewitz on war said something to the effect that war is just policy, political policy in a different form. He didn't say that, but it's close to that. Anyway, people are going to war more, and that is going to hurt us, and gains from trade are going to be eliminated, and that's not good. And that's something that's going to affect inflation in the long run in a negative sort of way. I mean, in a more inflation sort of way.
So no one wants to touch the Russia thing?
I would like a Kraken update, Mr. Moderator.
Oh yeah, is there a Kraken update? Oh, we don't want to know now. Okay, we've changed our mood out here. We don't want to know. All right.
Speaking of Russians.
No Russian thing. And the worst part is, I really liked that quote, Ed. I was going to write it down, and then you said it wasn't real.
No, it's close.
Okay, it's close.
Here,
Okay.
Here's an exact quote.
Okay, perfect. While I look at the quote, our next, almost last question is, this whole AI bit, it seems like a thing. Let's explore. Thomas.
Thank you. I've got 10 minutes for this, right?
Absolutely,
Good.
yes.
Now, what you're actually watching here is not me in real flesh. I'm actually an avatar produced by a generative AI called ChatProf. You should check it out. The marketing is still a little wobbly, but we're getting there. Now, I'm actually in class right now. My students are in Packard Hall taking my new elective called Machine Learning in Business. Now, I arranged for a guest speaker, which allows me to be here, and then I will run back to class after the event is over, or class will just end because we're over time. Now, I also spent some time at Amazon. I spent a day a week at Amazon as a visiting academic, and I've gotten a lot of exposure to this. So as you all know, so machine learning and AI has been around for a long time, right? Spell checks, a lot of things like this have been around for a long, long time. The explosion of the last 6-9 months is in the area of generative AI, so generating text, generating figures, pictures, speech, and so on. And I want to remind you of a little bit like why now? Why is it exploding now? 5 years ago, everyone would have said, oh, big data, it's all about big data. So great, data, we have lots of it, we have more and more of it, awesome. The next thing we need is hardware. Hardware has been sitting in your PlayStation and your Xbox since you were children. That's what a graphics processing unit is, a GPU. And this has been in computer game station, Xbox and the likes for a long, long time. And really what happened in 2020 is the invention of something called the transformer neural network. And this was a revolution in natural language processing that has led to the possibility of training large foundation natural language models like ChatGPT, like GPT-3, GPT-1, GPT-2, now GPT-3, and then GPT-4. This was not possible before this intellectual breakthrough that is extremely recent. At the same time, of course, we have lots of data and computing power. Now, I would like to dispel a little bit. It seems like ChatGPT, I'm sure you've all played with, can do almost everything. But really, it's very dumb. It only does one thing. It predicts the most likely next word based on a very short memory of 1,000 prior words. That's it. That's all it does. And it's very important for you to remember this as you assess the mistake it makes, or you read articles about how it goes off rails in some instances, because it's only thing it does. It's very, very narrow. Machine learning only does, each model does one very narrow thing. And in this case, it's predicting the most likely next word based on a memory of 1,000 words, prior words. It has no conscience of what you did yesterday, who you are, or anything like this. Now, it's a cool generalist model, and it seems pretty awesome. I think where there'll be more disruption going forward is when this thing was taken and specialized. When we take these models off the shelf, they're called pre-trained model. The GPT-3 weights, so the optimal weights in the model, are sitting online on GitHub. You can go look at them. There's 50 billion seemingly random numbers. That's the model. You can take it and you can do something with it. You can fine-tune it for a particular purpose, such as you want to improve your customer chatbot call center, and you just want it to be better. And you can train. What we're going to see in the future, I think, is a specialization of these models. Right now, it's a big general model, and we'll see specializations of these things for very, very particular tasks, because AI and machine learning does very narrow things. There's an NBER paper that just came out, literally last month, April 2023, that did an experiment. Researchers partnered with a firm and gave a generative natural language processing model to customer representatives. And they were there to help them, with the next, what are you going to answer next? What are you going to ask the client next? What's the next question? What's the next piece of information you can provide to the customer to resolve their issue? And the results are quite striking. Productivity increased by 14%, and it measured by the number of issues resolved per hour by customer representative. And in particular, that increase was driven by the most novice, the least experienced customer call center representatives. So these tools can help. They can render your job, a job, more efficient. Now, to be clear, will some jobs disappear? Of course, disruption always kills some jobs, but I think nobody here will, be sad that, typing rooms are gone or that stagecoach manufacturers have gone out of business. It's fine. New jobs will be created. Will your job disappear? People sitting in this room, given your UW education, I don't think so. You have very little to worry about. Will your job become more efficient? Will you be able to use these tools? Absolutely. You want to summarize a first draft of a summary of a 6-page document? You should absolutely throw it at ChatGPT or the next iteration of it and get your first draft of a summary, a 1,000-word summary, in a matter of seconds. And for these things, it's great. Is Skynet coming? No. I think we have very little to worry about for a long, long time. So I think these are very exciting times. There's a lot of stuff going on in all of our local firms and many other tech firms around the world. And I think I will close by saying that there's big ethical concerns, however. There are big fairness, responsibility questions that arise. And these can only be answered if non-computer science majors work in these firms on these problems. We need a bigger diversity of business leaders, or workers involved in these problems. You can't leave it just to the CS folks, because the CS folks, they'll just write really complicated algorithms without really thinking about the implications. It reminds me of the 2008 crisis, where you just have bankers writing fancy models to price mortgage-backed securities without really thinking about what's happening out there. And there's a risk of this here. So I strongly encourage non-CS, business folks in particular, to not be afraid of this and embrace it and help make sure we don't cross ethical boundaries or fairness and responsible boundaries in this sphere. But it's really exciting. I'm not worried. I think it's a lot of really cool stuff going on. And
Now you know why we had Thomas take that question. Stagecoach maker in an answer about AI. That was awesome. I think I've heard that in 30 years. So we do have one last question, and panelists, we're going to keep it to 1 minute each. Last year, we asked you to revisit a prediction from the past. This year, let's have you play futurist and make a prediction where things will be a year from now. And Skynet is not coming, is already taken. So Debra, Chris, Thomas, and then Ed.
Usually I try to disagree with Ed, but I'm going to do something even more dangerous and disagree with the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD, as quoted by Chris. I've lost count of how many years I've been predicting recession while
All of
sitting
them.
right here.
All of them.
All of them, yeah. So a year from now, we're going to be talking about the recession just passed and the aftermath of it. It would be great if the Fed could engineer a soft landing. There are kind of no examples in history where that worked. So that's what I think we'll be talking about a year from now.
Chris, rebuttal?
Not a rebuttal, I would never. I think we should all take a moment on May 9th, here is that where we are, the 9th, and enjoy the bliss of the political unity we have in this country relative to what we will be experiencing 1 year from now as the presidential campaigns are well underway.
That is a good prediction.
a year ago, I took a bet with my girlfriend about the price of gas at the pump. And I said, it's going to be way below $4, no problem. And I lost this bet handily. Now I'll take this bet again. And we'll say, a year from now, the price of gas is below $4. That's one. And two, very quickly, I will take a bold bet that I don't think we will be in a recession a year from now. There are many stock market wobbles. The price-to-earnings ratio is still high. We are in this recalibration. But I am confident in, if anything, like some growth angles, as I talked about AI as well. Like I do think that there's actually a lot of positive things on the horizon, rather than the moody, gloomy things that we always say here. And I will say we will not be in a recession a year from now.
I have some moody, gloomy things to say here. I think there will be military action by China. Probably in the Taiwan area, maybe in the South China Sea, Philippines, but trying to do some stuff, and it's probably going to be bad.
Enjoy the bliss of the moment.
Wait, really? That's what you're ending with? All right, China stuff bad. Okay, that actually concludes our show for the day.
I should.
Turn off our mics.
Should I talk about
Really quickly, before folks take off, one is thank you all. You all rock for sticking around this long and being a part of this experience. And then we have two groups we're going to clap for really quickly. One, for Nick and the Whittier Trust Group for presenting our sponsor this time. I lied, there's 3 groups. Group 2, Andrew, Ashley, Kristen, Melissa, Allison, and Eileen, who put all of this on and made it amazing. Thank you. And then to Ed and Debra and Thomas and Chris, our awesome panelists. Thank you so much. It feels like last year we are actually done. You can go home now. So thank you so much.